Good. Thanks very much. Thanks for having me, and thanks for coming out on a dark and windy night. What an unimaginative and terribly ambiguous title, and it's my fault because I didn't know exactly what I was supposed to speak about when it came to espionage. So I think, have I done it well? I've changed it just slightly to incorporate a ridiculously long and ambitious topic, modern history and spycraft today. It is an overview. It's going to be a very fast one. And it's designed in part, first a historical overview and then a more contemporary discussion. Designed in part to make something clear that I always try to make in teaching about this and talking about it. What we've seen in terms of professional spies, if you like, an intelligence community, rise of the intelligence communities, is nothing short of a revolution. For many historians, I'm not alone, we would liken it, of course, somewhat dramatically to things like the Industrial Revolution, scientific revolutions, in terms of the scope and especially the speed with which intelligence agencies have gone from being largely, well, actually totally non-existent, to being incredibly dominant in pretty much every country you could possibly imagine. Right? Canada, not the best example, the United States, a very good example. And this has taken place within about 100 years. So in terms of speed, it's hard to match the encompassing nature of this kind of revolution. And that's something I want to talk about. We all know a great deal about spies, at least we think we do, because they're constantly with us in public culture. And of course, most people who have some degree of education understand that spying is ancient. Spying is probably, what, alongside baking and prostitution, the oldest professions in the world. We probably spied when we were living in caves. There's nothing new about that. What is brand new, and I'll give you some examples of spies in history, and then the more important focus, which is institutionalized, if you like, permanent structures dealing with intelligence. That is a phenomenon. So while spies have been with us forever, intelligence agencies, permanent, centralized intelligence agencies, are a phenomena of the 20th century. And there's very, very few examples of intelligence agencies that existed before that. None of them truly centralized, none of them very permanent. So what you tended to have were military agencies, which is very true, or you had private intelligence services in effect. Something like Walsingham here, who was, of course, Queen Elizabeth's henchman. And talk about importance, you know, I'm going to give you a couple examples, but frankly, history is littered with examples of spies, unprofessional, impermanent, and certainly not centralized like him, but actually were game changers. So a major theme of what I and others talk about is how important spying has been and intelligence has been in crafting out the world as we know it, as opposed to treating it sort of incidentally, which is what a lot of historians do, sort of mention it where it's important. Folks like me with a focus on it tend to stress that it has been a major shaper and driver of government, especially over the last 100 years. Here's another great example, Napoleon's not so nice spy chief, who was famous for being an extreme revolutionary, which meant his widespread endorsement of violence and terror, and oddly enough, he brought that to his craft as Napoleon's principal spy in Europe. That didn't help Napoleon obviously win, but it did keep the French Empire alive for a very big period of time. And in similar fashion, sort of glancing through history, we all, I'm going to date you all, if you're old enough to know who Mata Hari was, then chances are she is synonymous with being the femme fatale, being the ultimate spy, right? Younger audiences, like my class, don't know her at all, which makes me feel really old, because I always thought Mata Hari meant spy growing up, because that's what I thought it was a phrase for. And the reason I present her and a couple of others is that even if they weren't actually spies, and there's a very strong argument that she was not a spy in any real functional sense, the sort of public imagination has been captured by spies. In much the same way that every day of my life, I get confronted with what I would say are conspiracy theories. People who have ideas about the world, some of them are, how do I say it charitably, really half-baked. Some of them are taken from social media, some of them are just way out there. Some have elements of truth. But the point is that people are never short of interest or attention on anything to do with espionage, right? It's a kind of dark side that we all have. We either are intrigued by it, or we want to be like them, or we're an absolute revulsion from them. But this has always captured our imagination. Margaret Zell, Mata Hari, a great example. If you're into this stuff, They just recently released new documents on her, and the documents are, again, inconclusive. So we still don't know precisely whether she was a spy. My personal feeling is that she was not. She was twisted by a bunch of very avaricious men and probably scapegoated to a large degree for French public opinion. On the other side of the coin, same idea of being absolutely fundamental to understanding public culture and their fascination with spies, you have Edith Cavell. So I often present Mata Hari as the sort of femme fatale, the harlot, if you will, of the business, the dark, sexualized side of being a woman. And on the other hand, a sort of virginal Victorian nurse, Edith Cavell. Canada has a mountain named after her. Virtually every Commonwealth country has something named after Cavell as being this innocent nurse who was executed for treason by the Germans in 1915. Truth is, most historians would say if you had to pick a spy or somebody engaged in nefarious activity illegal in war, it would be her, because she did actually help people escape, which was contrary to German military law in Belgium. But both of them, together, in virtually the same time and place, really did shape to a large degree public convictions about espionage at the turn of the century. Now, they are a little bit later than this chap, but nonetheless in the same sort of context of helping construct public, if you like, image about spying. One of the most important characters to actually get institutionalized spying underway is the Anglo-French writer William Le Queux. If you ever read any of his work, don't blame me, they are terrible. Generally, a cat could probably write better than William Le Queux. He wrote, I think it's up there, 150 books, so you can imagine how much thought and research went into these pieces of work. The reason that he's so important is that you can see at least 3 of the titles there. In a very volatile time frame, right in the ramp up to World War I, he wrote about real events, or at least had the real events going on in the early 20th century as his backdrop, and wrote absolutely ludicrously fictionalized accounts which he passed off as real. Here's where the historian comes out. It's timed with both modern education, if you like, meaning schooling open to the mass public, so people were actually increasingly literate, they read, and it also coincides with the advent of what we now call pulp fiction, right? Cheaply sold books at dime store novels, if you like, at newsstands. So his books were fantastically popular. Bestsellers throughout, which is of course why he wrote 150 of them. Spies of the Kaiser, 1909, alleges that there were 5,000 German spies operating in England. Most historians, I can't actually imagine one who would say otherwise, have told us that there is a grand total of 0 official, paid, centralized government spies working on behalf of Germany. So you see the discrepancy here. Public imagination, being what it was, got a hold of Le Queux's ideas in these series of books and literally demanded that the British public did something about rampant spying in their country. It was also timed with the development of a ship, the HMS Dreadnought, which I think I have here, that revolutionized shipbuilding and was responsible for the beginning of the naval race between Germany, England, and others. So the public panic was enormous. We're talking about mass crowds in England around Whitehall, demanding that Britain build more and more ships. And the end result, this is that famous case of fiction leading to fact, is that the government has to do something. The government of Britain, through what's called the Committee of Imperial Defense, did something rather extraordinary. It actually listened to a public, a very volatile public, knowing that the public was entirely wrong, that it was inflamed by yellow press, as they were called, and by Le Queux's sensationalist writing. And they yielded to that public by creating an intelligence agency. We know for sure, there's lots and lots of documents about this. Most members of the the Committee of Imperial Defense that formed this were very apathetic about creating agencies. They thought that people who believed there were lots of spies were generally unwashed, as they said, sort of dirty people anyways. Why should we listen to them? They thought the threats were dramatically exaggerated, and almost to the man, they all thought, because they all were men, they thought that basically spying was beneath us. It's a dirty business. So the last thing we want to do is institutionalize it. But that's precisely what they did. So the very first intelligence agency, permanent centralized intelligence agency, is 1909, and it's Britain. And you still have it today. It's MI5 and MI6, as you can see, right? Literally created under the umbrella of the British Secret Service, a response to the public and fiction leading to fact. What happens almost immediately, and it is of course pinned to World War I, is an enormous expansion. And that expansion, as I sort of bullet pointed here for you, nobody could have possibly estimated. I always, flush out thematically in my courses that intelligence, despite what people think, especially when they watch TV shows, intelligence is always usually behind the times. It's usually playing catch-up to the realities of the world, or certainly to public opinion. So it's never as sort of progressive and proactive as you imagine. Here, it's very true. The evolution is born by the tremendous threats of World War I. So because of the ramp up to World War I and then the war itself, most agencies are caught entirely ill-prepared, and they are really way out of their depths in terms of dealing with the scope and magnitude of World War I. That certainly doesn't stop them from trying, and that evolution takes off in really kind of sinister ways, as we'll see in 2 seconds. What happens, rather predictably, right in and around World War I, are the creation of other centralized agencies that didn't exist in other countries before. In the case of both France and Germany, they're sort of renamed and redesignated, but they're shifted from purely military intelligence to a much more comprehensive intelligence, right? It's a centralized intelligence, if you like, dealing with non-military stuff. And especially towards the end, you can see the emergence, although it's a very slow road for the Americans, the emergence of an American intelligence community coming at the end of World War I. In the interwar period, you have a phenomenon, I suppose, and I do use that phrase, that word, to describe a very steep professionalization trend. That spies go from being entirely amateur, because of course they were, right? If there's no spy school, if there's no sort of ways to try to train their spies, it's all left to their individual wiles. So even during World War I, the vast majority of enterprises that we call espionage were comical, quite literally. MI6 was a comical agency to start. It was headed by Mansfield Cumming, who's rather legendary. He lost his leg in a car accident, and then part of the test of a new recruit was that he'd take out a penknife and stab his leg repeatedly, trying to gauge the response of the young recruit. If the person panicked, then he said you weren't right for MI6. He entertained bizarre ideas. He was ripped off repeatedly. People came to him for plans of spying, including kidnapping the Kaiser's son, which were just a waste of money and time. This is a really, really inauspicious beginning to British intelligence, and similarly to other European agencies. In the 20s, it does start to change. You start to see a tendency, if not an absolute pattern, of trying to go out and get people that met certain hallmarks. So amongst them, being multilingual became a really important asset for rather obvious reasons. Being super smart and understanding everything about a nation and its culture, which is why I tell my students, if you really want to get into this business, you have to learn other languages and know everything about other cultures and their history, including things like music, things that you think are unimportant, because at the end of the day, that makes you much more likely to pass, if you will, as somebody who lives in that country. That trend does occur with some individuals in mind. Sidney Riley, who is arguably one of the most famous spies, although I don't think a great example in a way, not because of his notorious womanizing and drinking, that becomes a pattern unto itself for many spies, but because he was so arrogant and so silly that he got himself executed by the Russians in 1925. So not precisely the model we want, although television and movies have picked it up. This is a chap that for me is much more important, and oddly enough, about a year and a half from now, there will be a fantastic book about this guy which you should buy. It's by me, of course. He is my book topic, Sir Paul Dukes, a very little known intelligence officer who to me, and I think at least hopefully known intelligence officer who to me, and I think at least hopefully buyers of the book, is the real quote-unquote James Bond, a real inspiration for Sir Ian Fleming, who incidentally was taught by Dukes and who knew Sidney Riley too. The man of 100 faces, famed for his ingenuity, his report writing, his analysis, did the unthinkable, lived in the Soviet Union in the height of revolution and war, was arrested multiple times, managed to survive. Real character in a very brief career, so much so that he ended up being the first person ever knighted in the interests of spying. Right? So that's why he's Sir Paul Dukes. And I must point out, because it's utterly bizarre, he went on to become the world's leading expert on tantric yoga. I kid you not. And he dies in South Africa in 1967. Interesting guy. And examples of this kind of professionalization in the interwar period. The other really important and, of course, totally evil thing about the 1920s is how intelligence agencies in several other countries are not at all really intelligence agencies, or at least they double as intelligence agencies. Their principal job is to be the elements of extreme repression. And this is the fine line, right? I always look at students and I say, we start in 1909 with a joke of an agency in British intelligence, MI6, staffed by 4 people, literally a budget of £2,000, offices nobody could find, a terrible joke of an agency. And in the span of about 15 years, in Russia, you have an agency which is monstrous, both in size, scope, its killing capacity, the objectives that it carries out in the interests of being intelligence. And to a large degree, Lenin is a craftsman of this. He is the man responsible for the creation of the Cheka, Russia's first intelligence agency, which, although short-lived, becomes the inspiration for all other intelligence agencies in Russia, right up to and including today. As a matter of fact, SVR and FSB, the 2 principal agencies in Russia as we speak, both still have the same emblem of sword and shield. They imagine themselves to be a sword and shield as opposed to an intelligence gathering service. And in its short career, Cheka gives life to horrific repression, the likes of which, frankly, we should never forget, which is why intelligence is never really all that innocent or good. The man who starts it is Felix Dzerzhinsky, who is himself a prisoner. He was a Polish prisoner in the Tsarist era. Lenin thought nobody better than somebody who has languished for decades in a Russian prison to be head of an intelligence agency. It's kind of a cruel logic, but it works. And Dzerzhinsky takes to heart Lenin's 2 famous edicts, which is why I always look at people when they romanticize Lenin. Lenin, when he created the Cheka, said, I want you to create a special system of violence, which can't possibly be misunderstood. And then when asked for clarification, which by itself was courageous to ask Lenin for clarification, he said, I want you to defend the revolution without pity. Those are heady moments, right? When you create an intelligence agency, that's its mandate, to defend the revolution without pity. And very frankly, it does exactly that. So in the span of less than 15 years after the creation of a British centralized intelligence agency, in Russia, we start to see the elements of mass execution and state murder. And intelligence agencies are central to it. They're not the only perpetrators, of course, but they are the fundamental orchestrators of it, if you like, the essence of it. And it's not just random executions or the so-called pogrom or purges in Russia. It's things like this. The economic policy, better known as collectivization, a mass attempt to agriculturally change the Soviet Union, build it up into a great, powerful state. And this is the true face, right? The poster images, the propaganda, very different than the reality of what happens in Russia. Death and destruction followed. And quite literally, Cheka and all of its successor agencies demonstrate in very short timelines, again, about a decade, not even, how quickly intelligence agencies become fundamental to government in Russia, and as you can imagine, soon in Germany. That's certainly true of Joseph Stalin, of course, a monstrous dictator whose entire system was run by intelligence agencies. And that's where we must call it what it is, a terror state. Intelligence agencies in Russia gave life to these twin policies of collectivization, an economic policy. They weren't, of course, the architects of it, but they did help carry it out, causing, at least by conservative estimates, about 7 million dead in the 1920s and 30s. And then the second wing, the pogrom, as Russians call it, or the purges of the state, which murdered at least 7 million more. So in a very short order, and again, really like 2 decades, if you're being generous, intelligence agencies have gone from being a theoretical idea and a joke to being a murderous machine, right? And sadly, this is not the only example. This example, of course, is repeated elsewhere. Nameless, faceless people. If you're Russian, I'm of Russian descent, most conversations about this stuff end when you're trying to trace your family because everybody lost something. Right? So when you try to trace your great-grandparents or something like that, it usually ends somewhere in this sadness. You're probably very familiar with Solzhenitsyn and others who wrote about the famous gulag archipelago, also run by intelligence agencies, the enslavement and, of course, murder of millions of people there. There's a map to show you. Sometimes people think it wasn't real. Students in particular imagine the Gulag Archipelago to be some sort of fiction. They say, well, it's not when you look at maps and see camps scattered throughout the Soviet Union. And to show you how comprehensive intelligence becomes in a country like Russia, la révolution mange ses enfants, the revolution eats its own children. Right? Most of the leaders of the Cheka and its successor agencies, NKVD, are shot as part of the purges. Right? Not to mention, very importantly, the Red Army itself. Right? But this famous picture, only one man survives to see World War II. So important because, of course, Russia in World War II fares disastrously to a large degree because it did not have well-equipped and well-trained generals, courtesy of the purges, amongst other things. And then, of course, this unfortunate system, if you like, this critical dependency on intelligence or an intelligence-like system is repeated in Hitler's Germany. One of the top officials of Hitler's Germany is an intelligence officer, leader of the Schutzstaffel, Heinrich Himmler, of course a barbarous man to say the least, and his deputy, the head of German intelligence, the empire built by him is rather formidable, Reinhard Heydrich, who I suppose the only good news is he is assassinated in 1942 by another intelligence operation carried out by the British-trained Czech partisans. But he built a massive intelligence infrastructure called the RHSA, which you can see there, Reichscom Security Office. And it controls basically all of the elements of German intelligence you can imagine. He is the original bureaucrat of bureaucrats in building an empire. And most sinister, of course, is that he is responsible for the final solution. It's Reinhard Heydrich, later called Operation Reinhardt in his honor, that carries out the systematic execution of Jews, which of course gives us the Holocaust, right? So again, I look at people and I say the Holocaust was an intelligence operation. From start to finish, it's guided by, executed by, planned by intelligence at its core. An SS and SD enterprise, so much so that the Wehrmacht and other agencies are kept away from the actual movement of Jews and others. They don't run the camps. This is a very specific bureaucratic exercise run by intelligence agencies. And so when you see these, of course, horrific and haunting images, usually you see SA soldiers or Wehrmacht soldiers or sometimes SS officers, but at its core, this is really an intelligence op, the worst intelligence op you could possibly imagine from start to finish, carried out and responsible for the execution of millions of more people, right? Partisans, Jews, Romans, you name it, horrific, horrific stuff. And again, the camps as well, famous camps like Auschwitz, Treblinka, Dachau, run by the SS, which is in effect an intelligence agency first and foremost, right? Horrific stuff. Talk about a speedy devolution in this case, right? It's from a joke to mass murder in about 30 years in terms of our evolutionary trend. Far too much to talk about here, but a little hit list to show you about the degree to which Allied intelligence, as opposed to the Axis intelligence, was responsible for massive expansion in World War II. Some of these, I teach these courses in 13 weeks, and some of these take up an entire week or more to deal with in terms of their complexity. Things like Ultra, of course, the British top secret British coding and decoding program, which cracked the German enigma and gave the British an opportunity to listen to the Germans pretty much unfettered from the beginning to the end. Sounds like you could win the war in one day, but of course you have to manage the information carefully, lest the Germans suspect their code has been broken. So the reason I always flush it out, things like this, is that having success as an intelligence agency is one thing. Managing that success is an entirely different enterprise. And in it comes a really artful, very difficult process. Things like Ultra, for example, ultimately required people to make hard decisions about what they would and would not act upon, which ultimately killed the people, right? Because you can't let the Germans know that you've broken your code. And most of these, the Double Cross program and others, are really important aspects of an enormous expansion, not just in terms of physical size, but in terms of mandate that occurs in the US and in the UK, and even in Canada over the course of World War II. As a matter of fact, this last point is really important. Canada, only Canadians don't get this. I think we're the only people in the world that likes to pretend otherwise. Canada becomes a significant, if not major, component of international intelligence by working so closely with the British and the Americans in the course of World War II. So in fact, that's the foundation of what we now have today called the Five Eyes community, which is the basis of Western intelligence in the world as we speak. And of course, intelligence was instrumental in most of the important military operations throughout the war. D-Day, which is Operation Fortitude, the Battle of the Atlantic, Operation Torch, massive. And if that's not enough for you, scientific endeavors, communications, rocketry, and the atomic bomb are ultimately intelligence projects too, right? Run by the agencies, not just in terms of security clearance, but in constant vigilance about the scientists, the technicians, and everything else involved in it. So this is a massively, massively rapid expansion and evolution. And then, of course, you reach the Cold War. And for those of us who remember the Cold War, which is always great, it is synonymous with intelligence. I mean, the Cold War is espionage, and espionage is the Cold War. And to that degree, it becomes simpler, I suppose, especially in my courses. They have their exam coming up, so you can sell any notes you're taking or films, and this would serve as their exam debrief. It is intelligence because the alternatives are fairly stark. Once you have an atomic age, after August 1945, and especially after August 1949, when the Russians get their own bomb, basically your options are limited. You either run the gambit of a war that could lead to an atomic war, which is of course a dangerous thing to do, or you have to engage in diplomacy, which is of course slow and ponderous and usually ineffective. So in that spirit, espionage becomes a middle track, and virtually every government, especially American government, utilizes that. Espionage becomes a foreign policy, a very important foreign policy to sort of affect that middle ground between war and endless negotiation. And also what it does, really importantly, especially in the US, is to create, as we all now know, it's a military-industrial complex. It should be the military intelligence industrial complex, frankly, because you can't really separate between pure military and intelligence issues. They are one and the same. And I've written down for you just a little taste of some of the things that happened over the course of just even the first part of the Cold War, it's not even the whole Cold War, in terms of where intelligence finds itself. At the forefront of computers, rather predictably after World War II, where computers were pioneered, aerial reconnaissance, satellites, rocketry, which gets you to space, all basically intelligence issues. Pharmaceuticals, a few years ago they released films of the Defense Department drugging people with lethal doses of LSD and other drugs as an intelligence project to see what exactly would happen, as if you need to know. Chemical, biological weapons, you name it, this becomes the domain of intelligence agencies. And I suppose the real kicker here is that the United States, CIA, the most famous intelligence agency, isn't created until 1947. So for its own evolution, it is basically knee-deep in this stuff by the mid-1950s. Less than a decade after its creation, it is already at the forefront of profound technological change, and of course of governance. It literally is part of the United States government in an operative sense, not in a sort of theoretical sense. And here's how. This is the golden age, as they refer to it, the golden age of the CIA under Dwight Eisenhower. We have the two brothers, CIA director and Secretary of State, the Dulles brothers, rather famously. And what can I say of the golden age? Basically, anything the CIA wanted to do was sanctioned in the spirit of what they called plausible deniability. If you could deny it, which you could, then you could get away with it. And of course, this is, brings up all sorts of moral and ethical issues. But for us as historians, it certainly flushes out some of the most important things the CIA did in carrying out a foreign policy. That's really, really important stuff. Then, of course, I'm not condoning this. I don't think anybody should condone it. And I suppose to its infinite credit, the CIA and most American government agencies have come out and released their information and their involvement in these things. So it's not a matter of thinking about it or conspiracy theory. We have documents that substantiate it. In 1953, Operation Ajax overthrowing the legitimately elected government of Iran in a CIA coup, literally an orchestrated coup. Then developing a formula from that and applying it, a way to do it, buying off the media, the military, the police, getting an external candidate, in this case the Shah of Iran. Do you remember the Shah of Iran? The puppet for 30-odd years in America, American puppet in Iran. You take that formula and then you apply it elsewhere. Guatemala in 1954, almost identical, different person, different issue. Congo 1960, Cuba 1962. And behind this all isn't just the nature of the Americans wanting a favorable regime. There are very profound and obvious economic interests. In the case of Iran, it's oil, because the Iranian governments of Mossadegh, the man they overthrow, threatens to nationalize oil. In Guatemala, it's fruit. The United Fruit Company, if you like Chiquita Banana, you are engaging in CIA sponsorship, I suppose, because that's the subsidiary of United Fruit today. They overthrow the government of Guatemala. And oddly enough, that's why I put them on this overhead, to show you the non-separation, the degrees of separation, when the board of governors for United Fruit were threatened by the nationalization of fruit in Guatemala, they called up some former board members to say, can you help us? And those guys were the Dulles brothers. They had to resign their commission as board of governors on United Fruit in order to take office, but of course they're buddies. They go golfing, they have lunch together, their wives go shopping, all this 1950s stuff. And quite literally, it's a phone call away, and you too can overthrow a government in Latin America. And that's literally what happened. And I'm trying to be charitable about it, in case you're wondering. Congo, you don't do the bidding, but you have allies who do, and you overthrow a legitimately elected government, and then for good measure, you have assassinated Patrice Lumumba. In Cuba, of course, a famous attempt to get rid of Fidel Castro, culminating in the Bay of Pigs, which doesn't work. And then to show you again this golden age, more than just overthrowing governments, the development of massively important technologies. The U-2 spy plane, also part of the golden age, rocketry, space programs, satellites, virtually everything you can imagine. There's the U-2. Do you remember the U-2? Maybe you remember the U-2, one of the most famous planes, and a perfect example of this military-industrial complex. Right? This isn't imaginary or theoretical, it's very much alive. The U-2 is still alive. Some countries still fly them on a routine basis, like Pakistan, so this is a long-lasting plane. Developed within the corporate realm purely by the CIA. It's a CIA project, showing you the reach and the potential, if you like, between governments and industry. And there you can see some. Most of us remember, I wasn't alive, but I know it as a historian, the famous May 1960 episode with Francis Gary Powers, which of course was humiliating for the Americans, so-called Operation Grand Slam. He got shot down over Russia. To this day, there's a vigorous debate as to whether he was a Russian agent or just a really good pilot, because he managed to land a plane which shouldn't have been landed. It was specially designed to disintegrate. He failed to kill himself. He had a poisoned pin as part of his training as a CIA pilot, and he blew that. So the Americans never really liked him after that. And then famously exchanged in 1962, even more famously killed in a helicopter accident in California in 1977, which people think is a way of the CIA getting him back. And then, talk about covert ops. This is what I personally write about, at least some of the things I write about. The covert operations of the United States in places like Vietnam. For 30 years, the CIA and partner agencies, defense intelligence, national security, could do whatever they like, pretty much unchecked. The end result of this is really quite horrific, right? I mean, we're talking about chemical, biological weapons. We're talking about a whole realm of covert ops ranging from assassination to destruction. This is even before you're a protagonist in a war. It was madness. Literally madness. I mean, most of this stuff is hatched in the military-industrial complex carried out by the CIA, and it's only one of dozens of places where the CIA was active and is still active in some places like Pakistan. So for an agency created in 1947, for a latecomer to the intelligence game, the CIA and other agencies are fantastic. Just fantastic. I don't mean in a good sense. I mean fantastic, as you should be amazed. And then just in terms of technical stuff, stuff that we're still debating. We still don't know. And this is, I guess, tantamount to conspiracy theory for some. Project Azorian or Jennifer, probably the most expensive intelligence program in human history. We don't know how much, but into the trillions. All about getting a Soviet submarine from the bottom of the ocean, which of course carries the blueprint of Soviet technology. The SDI program, which you might remember if you remember the 80s, Ronald Reagan's Star Wars program, satellites in space. We're still living with that. Again, untold trillions of dollars governed by intelligence agencies. And then the downing of a Korean airliner, unfortunately named 007, in September 1983, rumored to have been a CIA passive probe. This is the Soviet submarine. If you don't know anything about it, the US eventually commissioned Howard Hughes, the famous billionaire, eccentric billionaire, the largest ship in the world called Glomar Explorer, retrofitted it, if you will, with all the top scientists and engineers in the world, and put a giant claw in it. It's like right out of a fantasy world. And that giant claw went down to the bottom of the ocean and picked up the Soviet submarine, complete with nuclear weapons. To this day, nothing has been officially released, so we're kind of in a gray area. Some people say it was a total white elephant, they got nothing. And others would argue that they got the blueprints of Soviet technology so thoroughly that they could then launch SDI, the Strategic Defense Initiative, with the idea of bankrupting the Soviet Union into the grave, which of course is somewhat what actually happened, right? The Soviet Union unable to compete with the United States in terms of technological industrial capacity, and eventually ended. There is 129, and there is the Glomar Explorer, complete with giant claw, just like in the bowling alley where you go down and pick up the stuffed toy. Unbelievable stuff. I just like doing this because I don't care anything about this stuff. It's all mumbo jumbo to me, but my engineers love this stuff. They know each one of these kind of components, and they think this is great. The SDI, untold trillions of dollars, largely unaccounted for. Do you remember this in the 80s, where there were news investigations about how wrenches, like Geiger wrenches, which cost $1 at the local hardware store, were being sold within the SDI program for like $3,000 a piece. Massive inflation by government corporations, by business corporations working with the government to create technologies, individual programs of SDI, which are dubious to say the least. And then KAL, the downing of an airliner, which, as I said, rumored to be a passive probe, and we're still trying to hack it out whether the CIA actually engaged in that knowingly in order to sort of test Soviet defenses or not. What we just found out a few years ago is that the Soviets actually managed to recover the black boxes, but never told us what's in it. So it's still a big murder mystery at sea, but it does show you the range of options that the United States has kept in terms of its intelligence capacity. This has got to be the title of my next movie, I think. I got to work it out. Because we also probably remember, if you were alive at least, that the Cold War was very much about an endless revelation of spies, human spies. Now, most people are interested in the human dimensions of spying, which I get, as opposed to communication stuff, which can be kind of dry and mathematical. All I'll say is that human spies, although terribly spectacular, because we can all identify with them, are the most precarious form of intelligence of all, right? Because humans make mistakes, and therefore they're the most vulnerable and really, really quite problematic. The other issue is that, very clear, the United States in particular never put a great deal of stock in human intelligence. They have human spies, but they've never really focused on it. The Russians did. And much to the amazement of certainly university students, is the patience of the Soviet Union. They began the enterprise of human espionage, if you like, in the 1920s, particularly on university campuses, like this one, as well as Oxford, Cambridge, and Yale, and Harvard, with the idea of finding amongst the body of students out there sufficiently malleable, like-minded individuals who would rise through the ranks of government or industry, and then by the time they're in their 40s, be potentially useful human intelligence assets. It's about a 20-year game that the Soviets play, starting in the 1920s in places like Cambridge, to nurture a network of spies which yield considerable dividends. And of course, the spy scare that follows serves two really critical processes. I always think like I'm speaking on behalf of the Russian government here, but I'm actually not. From a Russian perspective, it serves two purposes. One is that your spies can actually get out valuable information along the way, and two, once their utility is gone, either they're no longer useful or they're been compromised, then their revelation serves the second purpose, which is to cause panic amongst the target nation. And frankly, the Americans are the most panicked people on the face of the planet in terms of spy revelation. Right? Britain and Canada, much more sober about it, much more sort of, patience and understanding. The Americans periodically freaked out by revelations of spies, so it has become a tool of human intelligence. This, of course, to some degree gets it going. The famous Igor Kislenko revelations in the most unlikely place on Earth from Mississauga, Ontario. He recently, he died in 1982. His daughter is still alive and lives in Mississauga and now talks fairly openly about her dad. He revealed to the Canadian governments and therefore the American government that there were serious networks, Russian networks operating in each country. right? If they're spying in Canada, the logic goes, they must be doing 10 times that in the US. So what happens is the rather obvious spy scares of the 1940s. Now, some of the most important spies in that light, at least important for us historians, maybe not name recognition for everybody here, are people like Elizabeth Benton, because she's not Russian. She's an American girl. She's as about American as you get, doesn't even speak Russian. She actually has an Italian affiliation where she's recruited and becomes ultimately one of the most important warehousers. That's the name for somebody that can cycle information about other spies through her own network. Eventually testifies, but never faces any sort of jail time or anything like that. Revealed behind the scenes under protective custody to be the so-called Red Spy Queen, one of the most important spies of the 1940s. And really gives life to the so-called atomic spies, which I'm sure at least some of them you've heard of, right? Klaus Fuchs, the famous German-born English scientist who was instrumental in the Manhattan Project. And to show you what I meant about how the British don't panic in the same way the Americans do, when Fuchs is suspected, he's repeatedly investigated and interrogated, finally confesses to the exact same questions, I might add, over a period of years, finally gives it up in 1950. He gets 14 years in prison, and the British, try to bury it all away. They don't extradite him to the United States or anything like that, and then they release him. And most students go, well, that's not fair. And so, well, I never said fair was part of the game, was it? He's released. He goes to East Germany because he's German-born. He says, which Germany do you want to be deported to? He takes the East. And then he goes on to a spectacular life of being an atomic scientist for the other side. Right? So justice isn't really the issue here, but it does show you how the British deal with their cases quite differently. The same sort of crowd, not the same network, but the same crowd. This is the same network. Unfolding in the United States are the atomic spies you're probably familiar with. Harry Gold, the so-called courier of the atomic spies, working on sharing information, intelligence information. David Greenglass, who died not long ago, his claim to fame was selling his sister and brother-in-law for state's evidence so that he could be given a non-anonymity and live in the witness protection program. Not exactly a nice chap, but there you go. And of course, very famously, the Rosenbergs, Julius and his wife Ethel, about which there's still vigorous debate, at least to her innocence or guilt. I must tell you that most historians in this business have no doubt that certainly Julius was guilty, and that Ethel, by implication, most likely was as well. Whether or not she should have been executed for it is, of course, an issue. There was rampant anti-Semitism in the United States. They're all Jews in this network, which is important. And, of course, she never disavowed her communist inclinations, right? Her kids, and I think now her grandkids, are leading a spirited attempt to clear their name, or at least her name, still today. But sensational trial, right? I mean, this is probably, I guess, next to OJ, the most famous trial in certainly in American history. And then, on the other side of the ponds, but in many ways much more important, are the so-called Cambridge or Magnificent Five. Anthony Blunt's sort of top of the dog. The reason I always sort of flush these guys out is to show you what I just said. The patience and the very sort of strategic planning that the Russians had from the 1920s. They went out onto campuses, they recruited these men, and then 20 years later, they all rose to really prominent positions, right? Like substantially prominent positions. Blunt's probably the least important, if you like, of the lot, but sort of the man who gets it all started. Never prosecuted. None of these Magnificent Five ever faced any jail time, right? Which again shows you something about British culture, I suppose. But he was humiliated, being stripped of his knighthood. Actually confessed on television in 1979 and helped to discredit the Thatcher government, so important was he. Guy Burgess, much more important. I mean, if you sort of follow their career trajectories, you can see what the Russian logic was, is that these guys eventually would cross the most important organs and elements of the British government, and therefore be really important intelligence assets along the way. When you make it to the Foreign Office, serving in Washington, you've kind of reached the top of your profession, and all the way you're a Russian spy. Right? Rather inglorious ends, defecting in 1951 in hurried fashion, and died miserably in Russia, principally because he was gay and lived a very open lifestyle, which of course wasn't permitted anywhere in the 1950s, and sure as heck not in Russia. so he had a miserable time over the last few years of his life and died. Donald MacLean, his partner in crime, extraordinarily important in terms of his rank and power, making it all the way to secretary, first secretary in the US, and all of them leaking really important information to the Russians during the war, after the war, and so on. John Cairncross, who is often referred to as the fifth man, even though he didn't work alongside the other four, he did go to Cambridge. His job, probably the most significant technically in giving information that we know to be part of Ultra to the Russians, and then most famously Harold Kim Philby. The least capable of them all, the one who was a sort of C+ student, the Russians even said that of him in documents, the least intelligent, but the most charismatic. And he's so good, so talk about success, if you're the Russians in this long game like I talked about, he makes it all the way to being the chief liaison officer of British and American intelligence. His primary job is to find Russian spies in the United States and England, and he is one. So as the top spy catcher, who better than to be a Russian spy? And the Russians, of course, prospered enormously. Not so much to save themselves from losing the Cold War, but enough to make nightmares for the Americans and the British. And it continues. The Profumo affair, bringing down the British government in 1963, all with a very well-trapped young girl, right, who was sleeping simultaneously with the Minister of War and Russian agents. Very successful operations, low cost, if you like. How do we get our information? Mostly through defectors. And the defectors themselves, sensational, especially in the end of the Cold War and the early stages of the post-Cold War. Some of them are still with us, like Oleg Glulyavsky, Russians who literally came to the West with huge amounts of information and told us pretty much everything we need to know about Russian intelligence. My personal favorite, Vasily Matroikin, who was nothing short of being the archivist of Russian KGB, the librarian of the KGB, for the final. And the really funny part is that he walked across, he was in Latvia, so when the Cold War ended in Latvia, it was all very uncertain. He literally took like massive amounts of documents, personal memoirs and documents, shuffled across, dressed, sort of really, not very well, I suppose, as sort of an old man, dragging himself over to the American embassy in Riga. They didn't believe anything he said, so they sent him away. He walked next door to the British embassy. The British said, oh my God, come on in. Gave him protective custody, kept him alive, nurtured him, and he gave up massive amounts of information. It's literally called the Matroikin Archive. It's a huge series of books with Christopher Andrew, the famous British historian, who has told us everything we need to know. And then Oleg Kalugin, who was, of course, look at that resume, a man very, very important still today, a mortal enemy of Vladimir Putin as we speak. They never see each other, oddly enough, because he now lives in the United States, smart guy that he is. Started the Spy Museum, amongst other things, but before that was Russia's top agent in the United States. So when authoritative sources like this come out and tell you information, you can pretty much guarantee it's for real. What did they tell us? They told us about an endless array of spies leading right up to the contemporary. And this is where, of course, I wanted to go. George Blake, who's still alive, George Bahar, a Dutch-born Russian agent who is responsible for some of the most serious infiltrations of British operations overseas, and was therefore, of course, sent to prison for the rest of his life because he betrayed people that got them killed, right? Dozens and dozens of British agents. And I don't know why they haven't made a movie about this guy. He actually escapes prison in 1966, makes his way to Russia, where he still lives today, and is honored by the Soviet government on a KGB pension, no less. Marcus Wolf, the East German spy master, who managed to penetrate West German intelligence. It was the West Germans' fault for hiring a Nazi as their intelligence officer, literally Reinhard Gehlen, who headed German intelligence in World War II, became the principal head of West German intelligence, and they infiltrated it and brought his government, brought him down, brought the Gehlen organization down, and then brought down the West German government as a whole. Willy Brandt, the famous mayor of Berlin, Chancellor of West Germany, his government was brought down by a spy scandal. Now, if you're Russian, that's pretty cool. That's the dividend that you have for very patient, methodical sort of attack on your enemy, right? It's a long game, as it were. Guys like Yurchenko here, who double defected, if you can imagine, defects to the CIA, and then disappears again outside of a window in a bathroom. gotta close those bathroom windows if you're interrogating a spy. He goes back to the Soviet Union, but he told us in a short period of time stuff that rocked our world. The Walker revelations about US intelligence, naval intelligence in this case, another ring all the way up to the 1980s, and about Canada that comes home to roost. Yurchenko told us a fair amount about moles inside the RCMP, which were later flushed out, and as part of that, Canada drifted towards, a latecomer in the game, drifted towards its own intelligence agency, CSIS, created in 1984, amidst these revelations of how rotten we had become from within. Just in case you think I picked too much on the Russians, I can now pick on the Chinese too. Because in the 1980s, it was revealed that they had systematically been penetrating Western intelligence as well, using, oddly enough, in the case of Larry Wu-Tai-Chin, downtown Toronto as a principal base, using the diasporic populations of Chinese in many countries as a conduit. And talk about a good career, 35 plus years as a Chinese agent without anybody really discovering it. He hung himself in prison to avoid any testimony, never got. And then Jonathan Pollard, who was neither working for the Russians nor for the Chinese, but for Israel. The Israelis got into the game. Why wouldn't you get into the game? Especially spying on your friends makes logical sense. You've got to know your friends as much as you do your enemy. So Israel's capacity brought to bear in the 1980s as well. What did we learn? We learned that we're not done with spies. One of the most famous and arguably the most important occurred after the Cold War. Robert Hansen, the subject of the movies, an FBI counterintelligence expert who was working for the Russians, for diamonds, amongst other things, mostly out of revenge because he was passed over for appointments, arguably gave away more than all of the other spies you can imagine combined. We're still trying to figure out exactly what Hansen gave up, but certainly names of agents working overseas, as well as all intelligence assets the FBI had in the Western world too. Similar fashion for the CIA, Aldrich Ames, very important for Russian intelligence, even after the Cold War comes to an end. And then much more contemporary, and you might remember, I don't know, my students always remember this, unfortunately, as the guy who ate poisoned sushi, which is a horrible way to go through the rest of your eternity. He did eat poisoned sushi. An FSB officer, Litvinenko, not a terribly high-ranking one, but one that caused endless trouble for Putin's government by revealing the excesses of Russian intelligence in killing domestic targets and killing people in Russia, and of course for Russian atrocities engaging in Chechnya during the Chechen War. And for that, having fled to the United Kingdom, he was eventually hunted down and ate poisoned sushi at a restaurant in London and died, just to show you the reach of Russian intelligence. And then much more contemporary. Sorry?
Is it ate or he was fed?
He ate it. It was part of his sushi.
So it was a suicide?
Yeah. No. It was not a suicide. He was murdered.
I thought it was tea.
No.
It wasn't in his tea?
No, it was in his sushi. He ate sushi. They did a forensic test. You guys are good. Maybe it was in his tea too, but definitely in sushi. This is the Illegals, a group in 2010 that was all in the news. You might remember it. I did tons of media stuff over this, and the funnest part I had was that everybody fixated on the girl in the corner there as the sort of sex kitten, and I said, really? That's what you want to fixate on? Is one girl who might be slightly good looking, as opposed to what it represents in terms of what the Russians are trying to do. None of these were terribly important, to be candid. None of them reached a level of penetrating Western government that would be a serious threat. So we have to ask questions why they were there in the first place. And they were there, I think, personally, to mess with the American minds. The revelations of the Illegals came frighteningly too close to the famous reset of American-Russian relations with Hillary Clinton and the Soviet foreign minister pushing a giant red button that they bought at some cheesy hardware store, as if Russia and America were on a new path. And then within the span of a couple of weeks, the revelation that the Russians had been spying for decades with this so-called illegals. All of them had identities, some of them from Canada, which were taken from the dead. So it reads like a TV script. I can't help but to think the timing isn't coincidental, right? It's Russia's way of reminding everybody, especially in the States, that they're still out there. And there is Anna Chapman. She has become a sort of sensation, if you like, in Russia, rumored to be more than friends with Putin himself. She has adorned magazines, become the hallmark, quintessential femme fatale of the 21st century, and very much a demonstration of Russian capacity long after the Cold War and what we can do. People always ask me about spies in Canada. If you can read this numerous account here, you can see that we have quite a few. In the last few years, revelations have come to light about quite extensive espionage, particularly on behalf of Russia and China. Dealings that aren't exactly speculation, when some of them are actually caught, confess, and then get deported. Or, as is the case of CSIS warnings, you can see repeatedly there. I kind of sympathize with CSIS because the Canadian public does suffer from a certain amount of naivete about themselves and about why anybody would want to spy on us. And I think probably the most significant revelation was this. And it was in the news for a little while, but in typical Canadian fashion, we sort of quickly forgot about Delisle and went on to the hockey scores or something like that. Jeff Delisle in 2011 was arrested, subsequently convicted of espionage at Trinity Naval Base in Nova Scotia, which is the center of Canada's NATO partnership with other states. As a computer technician, he was privy to huge amounts of computer information that reveals how NATO would fight a war in the event of a war, which is pretty important stuff. Guilty by all accounts, and as a matter of fact, found guilty, not just by me. And most Canadians are sort of saying, what are you going to do? That's a substantial leak, and something that we still don't know the full extent of, but certainly compromises us. Today, and this is where I'm certainly going to wind things down, we are in yet another growth mode. Sad to say. There's this old saying by James Woolsey, who headed the CIA for many years, that the Cold War is dead, but there's lots of snakes in the jungle. And what he was referring to is that there's now multiple threats that we never accounted for. He's absolutely right. Since the end of the Cold War, imagine the expansion of threats in terms of countries, non-government agencies, NGOs, if you like terrorist organizations, rampant expansion of technologies, virtually every kind you could possibly imagine, proliferation of weapons. It has become a nightmare. And if you accept the fact, as I hope you do, that intelligence agencies are usually reactive as opposed to proactive, that means that we're behind the curve on every one of those issues. A classic example is in intelligence services. When the Cold War came to an end, we were still training Sovietologists. We're training people who were experts on the Soviet Union. And then the Soviet Union ceased to exist, and we needed very quickly to all of a sudden find experts who spoke Arabic and focused on the Middle East. And of course, they weren't as numerous as you think. So then you have to train a whole generation of them, and then you have to train the next hotspot and the next hotspot, and so on. And then if you add to that, of course, things like corporate and industrial intelligence, and a rampant expansion of new players in the game, Pakistan, Iran, Israel, and so on, it has become a nightmare to be in intelligence, a living nightmare. Now, this isn't to encourage you to think that anything goes or that we should allow anything to happen. Quite the contrary. A lot of experts, myself included, would argue that we have, in fact, engaged to some degree in overkill. That although the threats are quite legitimate, and I would challenge anybody to think that they are. I mean, some people say, well, isn't this all overblown? I really don't think so. The threats that are out there, depending on how you define them, of course, and what you know, are monstrous. But none of that legitimates in any way, shape, or form an intelligence agency or an intelligence community that is out of control, either in terms of its spending, its mandate, its conduct, or, if you like, the things that it thinks it can do. Because here in the West, and here's a vote for civil society, whether you like it or not, intelligence agencies are grounded in law. They have often violated those laws, as I've shown you, but for the most part, they are restrained by civil society, by things like constitutions, parameters of courts, and so on. And we cannot in any way allow that to change. The moment we do that, we are no better or precariously close to the slippery slopes that I've shown you before, where other countries have an intelligence agency that doubles as something else, like a death squad or a police state. I personally want nothing to do with that. And I do get nervous when I see something like the CIA as part of an intelligence community that is now monstrous. 17 agencies. Most experts would say they overlap in significant fashions. Their jurisdictions are conflicting, that they are, at least in Homeland Security case, a bloated elephant. Not terribly effective in what they do, but endless amounts of money and political leverage goes into them. You can see just how much. If the United States was a country, it would be in the top 50 wealthiest countries in the world. That's the intelligence community. It could have a flag and call itself a country. We're in trouble. And you get some idea of what kind of monies we're looking at. Those are public budgets. There are, of course, some secret budgets which aren't accounted for. And since 9/11, $500 billion. Can you imagine what 1% of that would be in fighting against poverty or food issues around the world, or I don't know, climate change?
Or sustainable development goals.
There you go. Anything. You could pick almost anything, for God's sake, and I think it would be meritorious, and you probably wouldn't even notice it in the grand scheme of intelligence budgets. So this, to me personally, is indicative of the way that we've gone. I understand why we've gone that way, mostly because of panic and a lack of understanding about the world. And now it's an alphabet soup of agencies in the United States, each with their emblem, each with their team. Some of them do fantastic work, I must say. They're really very much on guard. Other ones, not so much, if you're wondering. It's an odd collection, right? Some people look at this list and go, really? I didn't know they had an intelligence service. There you go. Military, intelligence, civilian intelligence, if you like. Some are agencies, of course, some are offices. It's a wide assortment, and it is likely to grow. That's the thing. The expansion, as I said off at the start, is so rampant that it's likely to continue as the number of threats out there multiply in the world. Where do we compare? Well, what can I say? We are slim pickings next to the United States, but then again, everybody is slim pickings next to the United States. The United States accounts for about 65% of global spending on intelligence issues. Even the Russians fail for them. So you can see our rather humble approach to intelligence. It's out there. But I wouldn't want to let you think that Canada is unimportant. Canada serves a very important role as the Five Eyes, part of the Five Eyes community. It's sort of, as some people say, a sober second thought to the Americans. Examples abound, like Iraq, which you might remember the Americans went into, launching a destructive, horrific war, which they're still involved in. Canada's intelligence community said there is no evidence of WMDs. We advised the government not to go to war. The government didn't go to war. Much to Canada's credit, it separated itself from the pack, as it were, using its own intelligence resources and its own analytical capability to avoid that peril. And then, as I say, stuff that's going to keep you up at night. In the old days, the Cold War intelligence was basically a list of maybe 2 or 3 things. What did you have to worry about? The Russians. That was the overhead. Now, look at this list. And each of these requires a significant focus within intelligence agencies responsible for them, in terms of training, spending, obviously the marshalling of resources. And it is an exponentially growing list. Things that never used to be on it in my time, for example, are now really front and center. Things like emergency preparedness, climate change, and so on. Those are intelligence issues, right? Like infrastructure is probably, if you talk to experts, and I do routinely, they would not put terrorism at the top. There's some really gifted, usually former officials in Canada and the US, who come out and say the whole fixation we have on terrorism is misleading. It's a threat, but it isn't nearly as substantial a threat as other things, like organized crime, which is much more invasive, much bigger an enterprise than terrorism, much harder to find, much harder to deal with. And those kind of issues, like slavery, people think, isn't slavery an ancient thing? Slavery's making a comeback in parts of the world. I used to deal with human trafficking here in Canada, and I was always astonished how stupid Canadians were. Like within the span of a 20-kilometer distance between my office and downtown Toronto, something went wrong with Canadians, and they imagined that these things happened elsewhere, when in fact they were happening down in Mississauga on Airport Road. Literally. It's amazing how sort of naive we've become. And of course in our lifetimes, especially if you're old enough to remember a non-computer age, a computer age has brought with it an infinite number of threats, right? Technological threats in the infrastructure, the grid, as it's often referred to. Not to mention hackers, whistleblowers, and all of that sort of stuff. And of course, the new frontier of election manipulation. Now, what could I end? I got to end on something, so I'm going to end on this. And people, of course, imagine that I know the answer to the question. I wish I did. I personally would say this is entirely within the logic of being a Russian intelligence agency to manipulate an American election. So it's not that far-fetched. People who sort of say, well, they would never do that. Are you talking about the same Russians that are? If the Americans could do this to Russia, they probably would. And of course, the Americans have done it to other countries, right? So we shouldn't sort of imagine this to be impossible in the realm of possibilities. Plus, frankly, no offense if you're a big supporter, but you have got a guy in Donald Trump who is a perfect recipe for disaster in terms of being manipulated. He's so profoundly arrogant, egotistical, demagogic-like, that he's a chicken waiting to be slaughtered by a smart crew of intelligence officers who hatched up an idea to influence him and his cohort. And of course, if you've been following it, it basically comes down to two questions. Did he collude with the Russians, and does it constitute an obstruction of justice what he's done? Of course, I'm no expert, but you've seen in the last couple of days more and more evidence that collusion looks to be very, very likely. Obstruction is, of course, the next question, right? Because that's how a president gets himself impeached, if in fact that ever happens. But the collusion part is looking scary. Thank God for the internet with wonderful graphs like this. Months ago, before he was president, I gave talks on his foreign policy, what it would be if he was elected. And of course, I had a running joke that he would not get elected, which was obviously wrong. And then on top of that, he had no foreign policy. Because the people in his foreign policy camp reads like a, I don't know, like nobody's in the classroom. There's nobody in his foreign policy camp. There never has been anybody of any sort of intellectual ability or renown. Your top guy was Paul Manafort, whose principal job for 20 years was to be a consultant to help monstrous dictatorships in Africa rehabilitate themselves, quite literally, and receive millions of dollars for it. Or better yet, to help Yushchenko in Ukraine, a pro-Russian government, to the tune of $12 million. An unsavory character, to say the least, but also a dangerous character. So when you add to it a son-in-law, a son, both of whom have no training whatsoever, who openly meet with Russians who are clearly connected to the government, it's hard not to imagine collusion as a possibility, right? Whether it will unfold is something else. And then, of course, the recent resignation of Mike Flynn is probably the most disastrous thing that could ever happen. When your national security advisor quickly goes down the pipe, collusion looks more and more possible, right? And this shows you how really successful espionage can be, how spy networks can operate. And of course, it leads us to this, a dangerous world in which we all live. Right? I always tell my students, when I was their age, I could go to the gate of an airplane to say goodbye to a loved one. Do you remember that? You used to be able to sort of go all the way, say, bye mom, put her on the plane. Have you ever done that since then? No way. Can you remember a time where we didn't have identity cards, where we weren't all subject to passwords and PIN codes and stuff? The days that guys like me remember, and some of you, are ancient history. They'll never come back again. Now we live in an era, especially if you're young, you've grown up in it, where everything is subject to somebody else's examination, legal or illegal as the case may be. And it is a dangerous frontier. There's no two ways about it. And whether it's bad guys or so-called good guys doing it on your behalf, like the National Security Advisory, National Security Agency, we live in a very problematic time where privacy and individual freedoms are absolutely at a bare minimum. So I do have to say this. The most important thing in this calculation for, I think, anybody, me especially, isn't that there are threats or that there aren't threats. People always like to sort of measure it on that. I'd say there absolutely are definitively threats, and that intelligence agencies and spying in general, not to mention terrorism and other nefarious acts, are the new norm in Canada and every other country. We have to accept it. So the real issue, therefore, becomes maintaining a civil society. And at the end of the day, maintaining a civil society is everything. How we so readily give ourselves up to the desires of intelligence agencies, like in the United States equation, or even here in Canada, where we caught some of our agencies doing things that are not in their mandates, and most Canadians paid attention for a couple of days, Globe and Mail article, this, CBC showed that, and then quickly forgot. We can't do that. If we forget exactly why they're there and what they're doing, and don't rein them in on a routine basis, we miss the whole point of defending a civil society. And without civil society, we are absolutely nothing whatsoever. I'm going to stop. How's that? Is that okay?